The story of Delgo's development is one of blind ambition. Two men began the project in hopes of telling a very human story in a non-human world. A grand-scale epic about two people struggling with prejudice and war. What we got was a film out of time, one that was made outside the Hollywood system by untested filmmakers and animators. It was an epic fantasy film written by people who had only dipped their toes into the genre, and ultimately, it was doomed from the start. The idea of Delgo was the brainchild of Mark Adler and Jason Maurer. Mark had initially started an interactive technology and design agency called Maritime Intelligent Communications in 1991. Jason joined 3 years later in 94. Eventually, Maritime would evolve into Fathom Studios with the development of the film. The idea came about when Jason was experimenting with early motion capture technology. Mark was passing by, and the rest was history. Mark always wanted to make a movie, and so did Jason. So Jason and Scott Beyer wrote the script with Mark providing the editing. The team at Fathom began with a proof of concept which was sent around Hollywood. The proof of concept was not seen since, but apparently it was so good that the team went into full production. Since Fathom Studios was founded in Georgia, the crew had a limited pool of talent to pull from. While they claimed to have some top talent from Hollywood on the team, they only had a few people from there, like Floyd Casey as a VFX supervisor, Jeremy Vickery of VeggieTales fame as a lighting director, though a lot of the team were fresh faces straight out of the Savannah College of Art and Design and a few other small colleges around Georgia. While the graduates were trained on some of the latest animation programs, they didn't have the same level of experience needed for the film of this scope yet. To be completely fair, the early 2000s didn't have the glut of 3D generalists as we do now. There's also the possibility that the film used motion capture technology, which if true, would have put it on the bleeding edge of early 2000s technology. This also would explain why there is a lack of gravity to the characters' animation sometimes, and why most of their animation lacks a certain level of exaggeration. Well, except for Philo, but we'll talk about him in a different section. Oh, I have some things to say about you. While Delgo was in development, the team was aiming for a 2003 release. But the film came out in 2008. While it's hard to get an exact timeline of what happened, it was clear that the film was still in production after 2005. There were also delays in the film's distribution. The first was that MGM went through executive restructuring and dropped the film from distribution. Then Kevin Foster, the president of Fathom Studios' parent company, Macquarie, died of a heart attack, which delayed the film for another year. The delay may not seem like much today, but back in the 2000s, 3D animation was rapidly advancing with every passing year. Computers were getting stronger, and by the time Delgo came out, its visuals were being outdone by other films. Keep in mind that Kung Fu Panda and WALL-E came out in the exact same year. Also, Avatar came out the year after. Funnily enough, the filmmakers decided to sue James Cameron on account of their film's premises being very similar. But nothing actually came of it, and at the end of the day, Delgo looked very dated for when it came out. A wise man once said that graphics are temporary, art direction is forever. Some of Delgo's art direction isn't bad. It's like if Morrowind came out in the mid-2000s. Its issues arise when you look at the main characters. Their designs lean too much into being human, and let's be honest, 3D animators were still struggling with realistic humans. Never mind weird human-alien hybrids. They dive headfirst into the uncanny valley, where they are both all too human, yet not human enough to look appealing. Sure, the concept art looks far better, but the team's experience and tech simply wasn't there. These designs were likely made to accommodate the alleged use of motion capture for the film, which was likely a constraint on how inhuman the characters could be. This is one of those cases where they would have been better off with more stylized character designs and dropping motion capture altogether. There is also the issue that the Lochni and the Norn aren't that physically different despite coming from two very different biomes and being two very different people, which just screams wasted potential. Of course, the visuals weren't the least of the film's problems. Like many Doom from the Start entries, Delgo suffers from a lot of writing issues, and the vast majority of them are front-loaded, the most egregious of which being the 6-minute-long exposition dump. When it comes to writing a story in a constructed fantasy world, it is super tempting to lead with a narrated exposition about the setting you've made. One must be careful with how much exposition is presented at first, and then how much can be spread out through other methods of storytelling. There are two intros that could be compared to Delgo's. The first one is one of its original contemporaries, The Lord of the Rings. Their intro is similar in intent like Delgo's in that it sets up the key players in the story and introduces the setting. However, there are two major differences. The first is that in Lord of the Rings, we are being shown events that happened far before the story started, ones that the main characters didn't witness, whereas Delgo and the Norn Emperor were present for a good chunk of these scenes, which means they could have been shown rather than told. There are, however, elements that absolutely could have been included in the opening narration. The first contact between the two people, the war, our main antagonist's backstory and banishment, her attempt on the royal family could also be included, but on the other hand, it could be implied and revealed later on in the story. Perhaps as an argument between the princess and the emperor. After all, Sidessa's assassination attempt was why he's so protective of her. So what makes for a good, succinct intro exposition? Let's look at the iconic intro to Avatar: The Last Airbender. What does it do that makes it so effective and memorable? First, it's to the point. It introduces the concept of bending, the Four Nations, the main conflict of the setting, and introduces us to the situation Katara and Sokka are in at the story's beginning. All of it is within a minute and 19 seconds. It says just enough for you to get the idea surrounding the story, rather than spoon-feed you the story outright. What isn't covered by their narration is covered through visuals, which is called efficiency. Delgo did not need a 6-minute-long intro exposition. It just needed to be told effectively. Also, did I forget to mention that the Lochni can also learn a legally distinct version of the Force? It involves magic stones, but functionally it's the Force. You'd think that the fact that it keys off Delgo's mental state would weave the magic system into his character arc of him letting go of his hatred and prejudice. But no, doesn't really matter all that much. Wasted opportunity. Another issue is the tone of this film. It simultaneously wants to be this melodramatic fantasy story, and then it also wants to be an awkward comedy film. Sure, you can put comedy elements in a dramatic fantasy story, but maybe you shouldn't have... this guy. There's a reason I have a grudge on purely comedy relief characters, and it's guys like this. He does nothing but hamper other characters in service to make the exact same joke over and over and over again. Whoopsie doodle, Philo just goofed up again. Ain't he a klutz? I've probably said this before, but it bears repeating. A comic relief character should be a character before being comic relief. If you were to remove Philo from the story, you would have an objectively better film. Or you could rework him. Either way is fine. The director once claimed this film was going to be better than Shrek, but if there was a single example of what Shrek did better, it would be their comic relief character, Donkey. If you took Donkey out of Shrek, the film would fall apart. Shrek would not have the same character arc because Donkey is there to, in his own way, push Shrek to be a better ogre and open up about himself. He couldn't bring himself to tell Fiona about his feelings, but Donkey pushed him to open up. Oh, and he f***ed the dragon too. What did this guy accomplish? Anything? Nah, just he beamed a soldier at the very end of the film, after the main conflict was solved, so it doesn't even matter anymore. The character is just plain irritating, and every time he's on screen, it's just pain. Outside of some weird editing choices and animations that seem a little janky, the rest of the film is actually quite serviceable. Delgo and the princess's romance could have used a bit more development, but it's not like they had zero chemistry. Then there's Sedessa, who is completely hamming it up for the film. She is a wonderful villain for the story. She herself is an unrepentant Norn supremacist who manipulates events to restore her place on the throne. She's played by the late Anne Bancroft, who died 3 years before the film's release. She's the only character who manages to balance out the comedic portions of the film with the darker ones. Also, once you get by the halfway point of the film, it actually starts to find its footing and is executed completely well. Which could also imply that the film was completed in chronological order, but I'm just speculating on that part. A lot of films don't actually complete their scenes in chronological order. I mean, who would actually do that? Surely these guys wouldn't. It's clear that Mark and Jason were ambitious people, but ambition alone isn't enough to make a film. They had the funding, and they had the technology, but they didn't have the experience to make a fantasy movie of the scale they wanted. Their team was full of fresh blood with only a handful of veterans in a field that was still new at the time. What's more is that the film's story was told poorly. It had way too much exposition in the beginning and not enough character building. It didn't have a clear tone until about halfway through the film. What's more is that by the time the film came out, the standards of 3D animation were far higher than the team could have done even in the best circumstances. The only way Delgo could have been a better film is if it wasn't the company's first outing. They should have started with shorts or commercials to develop their pipeline and train their animators. And then the writers should have read more fantasy books and films, especially the bad ones so they don't make dumb decisions about storytelling. Leaping right into an epic fantasy film with an inexperienced production team was what set the film up for failure. The only consolation is that a large chunk of the animators and 3D artists would go on to work on other films, some of which actually came out before Delgo did. Thank you all for coming to see another installation of Doomed from the Start. If you have any recommendations for another Doomed animated film, please leave a comment, like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you want to see more. I'll see you all next time on Doomed from the Start.